Howdy. Here's a question for you. What's happening with Deltarune's whole parallel story to Undertale thing? Characters that shouldn't even be born before Asriel's death in Undertale are alive and well in Deltarune. Also, Asriel isn't dead in Deltarune. So, what does Toby even mean by parallel story? That's the question that sent me down a rabbit hole, causing me to create an actual timeline of events. So, to understand how Deltarune parallels Undertale, we first have to actually map it out. There's not a lot of explicit dates in Undertale, so I'm going to explain it in 3 parts. The Monster War, Chara falling into the Underground, and Frisk falling, which leads into the story of Undertale. I'll also be periodically setting rules to keep the timeline nice and flowing. This video is mostly a template timeline with a little bit of speculation, and depending on what theories you believe, some events may change position in the timeline. Now, for our first rule. Rule 1. Undertale and Deltarune fundamentally make sense. Things stated in the game and in official media are done with intent. Jokes can still have ramifications for canon, despite being jokes. Now, shall we? At some point before the War of Monsters and Humans, Asgore and Gerson are born. We know that Gerson fought during the war, and we can assume that this is Asgore, not just because of the silhouette, but also because of the history book in Toriel's home. Now, for simplicity's sake, I'm also going to assume Toriel's born before the war. The earliest I could actually find her being mentioned is the King Fluffy Bun story, which is well into them being at New Home in the castle. Then obviously we have the war. Gerson tells us that the history surrounding this is shaky, and the only real reference we have for this is one throwaway line from Brady and Caddy saying it's been like millennia, which isn't even spelled right, so that should show how much info we've got to work with here. Howdy, from the future. So it turns out that the Undertale text stump that I was using uses an older version of Undertale, which means Toby retroactively went in and fixed this grammar mistake. Whether that means something is up to you, just thought I'd mention that in current day Undertale, this is actually spelled correctly now. In order, a human soul is absorbed by a monster, then war is declared by humanity. The barrier is created which allegedly seals humans' abilities to use magic, and home is established in the ruins, because monsters fear humans too much to brave the caverns. However long after that, monsters begin to populate the rest of the underground, no longer fearing humans after so much time. New Home is made the capital, but is used mainly for monthly addresses to the kingdom by the Dreamers, as they still live in their ruins house. In 1998, a nose-nuzzling championship happens, likely in New Home, which Dogami and Doggeressa in their youth lose to Toriel and Asgore, a grudge that they still hold till we play the game. In 2000X, Asriel and Chara are born. Asriel has to be born after monsters leave to populate the rest of the underground, because we see the VHS of when Toriel was pregnant, which can only be gotten from the waterfall dump. Now, the reason I put the war so far before their births is because it fits story writing wise. Establishing that boss monsters live eternally without children kinda loses its weight if the war was very recent. And, stick with me, humans left Mount Ebott after losing their magic, hoping to never give monsters the opportunity to take their souls and break the barrier. However, just like with the monsters, history became muddied, stories of the mountain turned into legends, and hundreds of years later, humans migrated back, not realizing the truth of the tales. The Undertales, that is! This would explain why there is no humans that fall for such a long time, and then the sudden influx of humans after Chara falls. Towards the beginning of 2010X, which is what I'm calling it, Chara falls into the underground, Asriel finding them and bringing them home through the slew of dangerous puzzles designed to keep humans out. Near the end of 2010X is when the Dreamers move into New Home, with a house that can actually accommodate both their children. The logistics of a human living in a house made for monsters, and not even 4 people, definitely confuses me, but there are many reasonable assumptions you can make. The end of 2010X, Asriel and Chara die. Also, the Nose Nuzzle Championships are cancelled, no! This is mostly because the Dogai have to hold their grudge till present day, and in the True Pacifist they finally get first place. Additionally, the Royal Memorial Fountain is built, likely in remembrance of the death of Asriel and Chara. Before the next era, we do have to talk about Gaster, not a lot, but new rule. Rule 2. Gaster being shattered across time and space removed him from people's memories, but did not erase his actions. This is to allow the timeline to be linear and not have to deal with timey-wimey shenanigans in Undertale's timeline. Now, with that rule being set, Gaster has to be shattered and long gone from a linear sense before Alphys becomes Royal Scientist. There are tons of places you could put him, and I have my favourites, but I'm not going to theorise about Gaster here too much. At some point, he's born, made, transported, we really don't know, then becomes a royal scientist, gains a reputation for being an irreplaceable genius, and creates the core, maybe not in that order. Then he falls into his creation, being shattered across time and space. 2022, Napstablook is born. Napstablook goes by Napstablook22 on Undernet. They also obviously have to be around for Mettaton getting their robot body built by Alphys and leaving them. Napstablook could be born earlier to be fair, but there's no real way of knowing. 2091, Undyne is born. Undyne goes by Strongfish91 on Undernet. She wasn't born in 1991 because she's never seen Toriel, only heard of her from Asgore due to their close relationship. 2095, Papyrus goes by CoolSkeleton95 on Undernet. Him being born before Carafel is improbable since Sand says he's never seen a human. Now, somewhere between Asriel and Chara dying and the Skeleton Brothers arriving in Snowdin, the 2nd through to 6th human fall, the 7th falling a long time before Frisk. Additionally, during this uncertain time frame, Chiron's sister falls down. Mettaton meets Alphys. Alphys builds Mettaton's body to present to Asgore as an artificial soul. Alphys becomes a royal scientist and is tasked with researching Soul and the barrier. We know this happens after Asriel and Chara dying because they are both dead before Alphys writes entry number 4, as well as Alphys not knowing Toriel, meaning she wasn't alive when Toriel was queen. As in, the kids' deaths weren't recent as of entry number 4 being written. Around 2100X to 2110X, Papyrus and Sans arrive in Snowdin. Sans and Alphys have some sort of past, so it's possible that the blueprints that Alphys talks about are ones given by Sans, which could be the ones made by Gaster. Regardless, Alphys begins the determination experiments, making Flowey and the Amalgamates. Flowey has a bunch of resets here, but for the linear timeline, Flowey escapes the lab and doesn't cry to Asgore. However, he does at least become acquainted with Papyrus. Alphys and Undyne meet at the garbage dump. A week before Frisk falls, Mettaton puts in their fountain over the Royal Memorial Fountain. The sign saying Mettaton added last week could be much older, to be fair. Finally, 2110X. Frisk falls and we as the Soul play the game. The year is speculation, however, Sans mentions that it's likely been about 100 years since Toriel laughs when they first meet. Sans is known to guess information well based off arbitrary information, based on all of his refight dialogue and the genocide route. Wow, we finally got through the timeline! What now? What do you mean? We can finally start the video. If we copy and paste Undertale's timeline over to Deltarune, it's blaringly obvious that it doesn't line up in the slightest, so we have to reinterpret and move around some events to fit. Asriel is the main problem here, with him being alive on the surface and not dead for 100 years. Okay, there's a ton of problems surrounding Asriel, so he might be important figuring out Deltarune's timeline. Clearly, Deltarune has different rules to Undertale. Magic doesn't seem to exist, monsters are subsequently not made of magic so can bleed and stuff, but still seemingly turn into dust? Like, do boss monsters exist? Is Gerson dead because he's old as hell, or is Gerson dead because he had a child and was a boss monster? And then the whole thing with Dark Worlds. Rule 3. Magic is sealed for monsters in Deltarune. This affects things like boss monsters not existing, monsters being able to bleed, and also presumably people cooking regularly rather than with fire magic, for example. So, let's start making some parallels. First, I think that Chara and Dess represent each other. The deaths haunting the narrative and being Asriel's best friend who die. Like, clearly we are meant to draw some kind of connection between these events. The problem is that when we see Asriel and Chara, they're both still very young, still wearing the striped shirts and just generally having statures similar to Frisk. But Dess is clearly an older teen. My guess is around 16. She has leaves, a general alt vibe to her room, is rebellious, especially in comparison, and likely spite of, Carol, and Asriel's belongings being scattered around hints at them either being romantically involved or very close friends, as well as dragons she traced and kept hidden under the bed. Meanwhile, Chara and Asriel seem to be children, again with the striped sweaters, but also Asriel's first form seems to be right before he died. He's as short as Frisk and has no horns, even though his one appearance in Deltarune definitely hints towards him having them, which is supported by Chris being insecure that they haven't grown any, which likely happened before this flashback because Chris can be seen with their red horned headband. Second, Snowdrake is a teen in Undertale, while Monster Kid is a kid. However, both MK and Snowy are similar age to Chris and Deltarune, as they're all classmates. Noelle is as young as she is during the Chapter 3 TV flashback scene as she is in Undertale. Burgerpants is 19 years old during Undertale, and seemingly the same age as Asriel and Deltarune. Caddy and Braddy also seem to be Asriel's age, as Caddy and Asriel went to some sort of school dance together. However, an important note is that all of the Undertale connections here are at the same time, when we control Frisk. So, if we move these events around being based on when the soul enters the picture rather than when Frisk does, then that could explain some things. Unlike what we did with Undertale, we're going to work backwards from when we, as the soul, arrive in Deltarune. Chris, and presumably their classmates, are about 17 years old, supported by us knowing that Chris is headed off to college someday soon, and that Asriel seems to be a first year in college, based on how recent everyone talks about his leaving being. We also know that How to Draw Dragons is overdue by 2,583 days, which we also know that Dess was around for, or had just gone missing during this time, again because of the saucy Marv dragon under her bed, which could explain why Toriel is seemingly so uncharacteristically protective of not returning the book, being that it holds importance to Asriel because of how close it was to Dess's disappearance. Regardless of if that's true, that is 7 years and 28 days. This would make Noelle and Chris about 10 years old, which lines up with how young they both look during the flashback in Chapter 3. Sometime after that, Chris gets the soul. It's hinted that they've had the soul since before we connect to it, because of the birdcage and the bloodstain, so I propose that we put it here, 3 years after Dess disappears. If things like Burgerpants being 19 are connected to when the soul enters the picture, then putting it here makes some of the confusing ages fit nicely. But that means this Noelle and this Noelle are 10 and 13 respectively, despite using the same sprite. It isn't too bizarre for them to use the same sprite as just young Noelle to differentiate from current Noelle, but thought I should mention that. So, in 2000X, Asriel and Dess are born, paralleling Asriel and Chara. 6-ish years after that, Noelle and Chris are born. Chris is also likely adopted here, or very soon after, which is why they don't understand why their horns won't grow in. Because they're human. 10-ish years later, in 2010X, is when Dess disappears. Asgore likely loses his job soon after, along with the Dreamers divorcing. 3 years later, when Asriel is 19 and Chris and Noelle are 13, Chris obtains the Soul. Whether this is because of Chris and Caddy summoning a demon, something with Gaster, or even something with the Knight and Carol, is up to you. 4 years later is when Gaster connects us to the soul inside Chris, and this is Chapter 1. Or at least, that's my best guess. I think we do have some things to glean from trying to draw parallels in the characters and stories, whether that's for generally mapping out the timeline of events, predicting gimmicks and character themes, or theories of the insane variety. I tried not to speculate all too much on the actual timeline mapping, because my goal is for other people to use this video as a jumping off point for theories if they need to. If you do have any critiques of the timeline or anything to add, then please let everyone know in the comments. I really do think nailing this down could bring some interesting analysis to light, or at least be used as a tool for theorizing. And in case anything confuses you evidence-wise, I'll be linking the Obsidian Vault I made to organize everything in the description below. I used a few community plugins to help organize things, so I suggest downloading them when prompted, but you don't have to, obviously. Additionally, I'd like to thank the Deltarune community Discord and the Shay community Discord, as well as my Twitch chat over at Martian_Fox. Yeah, a little quick plug for you. There's a lot of stuff in these games, and these communities were very friendly and a big help when I got stuck in some places, so if you need help with anything similar, they are definitely great places to be. Anyway, I'm about 2,400 words deep into the script, and that's ignoring the time I spent actually making the timeline and recording everything, so I'll be off now. Thanks for watching.